Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tim Robson. I'm the Deputy Director of the Calvin Smith Library, and we are glad that you are here for this, which is the third of our 2008-2009 Digital Library Lecture Series. Every time when I do these introductions, I always try to give good acknowledgement to our very generous funders of this series. This year, the series is graciously funded by the Mario M. Marino Fund for the Innovation and Application of Advanced Information Technologies, and the David R. Bender Endowment Fund for Library Staff Development. And this year we're also very pleased that the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities has been a co-sponsor of these events. Earlier this academic year, the Digital Library Lecture Series featured in October a paired set of lectures by Mel Goldstein from the Anthropology Department here at Case Western Reserve and David Germano from the University of Virginia speaking about digital humanities research in Tibetan oral history and culture. And then in November, we sponsored Dan Cohen from George Mason University, who spoke on the topic of digitization of the historical record and its use in humanities research. And at that talk, there was special interest on the part of many in the audience about his team's development of the Zotero bibliographic citation tool, bibliographic citations, as well as a lot of other things as well. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Kathleen Woodward. Professor Woodward is going to be speaking on the topic of intellectual wealth of digital networks. Kathleen Woodward is professor of English at the University of Washington, where she directs the Simpson Center for the Humanities, which established digital humanities as a key initiative in 2005. She is the author of numerous publications, and among other of her many scholarly endeavors, she is a member of the steering committee of HASTAC, the Humanities, Arts, Science, and Technology Advanced Collaboratory, and she's on the International Advisory Board of the Consortium of Humanities Centers and Institutes. One of Professor Woodward's most recent publications appears in the winter 2009 issue of the journal Daedalus, in which she writes about the future of the humanities in the present and in public. And I just want to read a very brief excerpt from toward the end of that article to sort of set the stage for what she's going to talk about this afternoon. So this is a quotation from her article. Over the past few years, the exploration of digital humanities at humanities centers has accelerated at an exponential pace. New methods, among them text mining, visualization, virtual environments, and collaborative digital research spaces, are being invented and tested. New ways of representing our scholarship, integrating text, image, sound, and video are emerging as are new ways of disseminating it to ever broader publics. One of our main challenges today is to integrate new forms of digital publication with the wealth of traditional forms of printed knowledge, creating powerful hybrid forms, a synthesis of printed and digital media, knowledge that circulates widely. And here it is that digital humanities and public humanities forcefully intersect. So please join me in welcoming Kathleen Woodward.
This is a lovely invitation, which I very much appreciate, and thank you very much for that very nice introduction as well. I really am speaking here as a director of a humanities center. This is an institution that I love and think can serve a campus in an absolutely transformative way. As you mentioned, we've been for the last 4 years, putting digital humanities as, I would say, our most important initiative, and I know you're involved here too at the national level with some of the projects that the Mellon Foundation has funded. I also want to congratulate your Humanities Center on having received a challenge grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Those are fiercely competitive grants, and I'm saying this also with a certain amount of boasting rights because we received one as well, and I immediately began to see what the percentages were, how many had been funded. Fiercely, fiercely competitive, so congratulations to your campus. I'm taking as my title the intellectual wealth of digital networks, and you're going to see that this rhymes with the title of this book, The Wealth of Networks, The Wealth of Networks by Yochai Benkler. I'll refer to it in passing a few times. But I do want to say, this morning when I was at breakfast, the person who was pouring coffee came by and said, "Oh, the wealth of nations." And last night, when I checked in at the hotel and I had this, like the person at the desk said, "Oh, the wealth of nations." It's just so interesting that this transposition between the two would take place, because in great part the argument of this book is that we have to look at non-market institutions. And of course, an institution of higher education is precisely one of those. The argument is that information is a commodity. It doesn't even want to use the word commodity, a form of knowledge that actually is circulating in non-proprietary networks. And so the wealth that's being created is being created in a different kind of way, outside of, in great part, regular networks. So a lovely pun on the wealth of networks, the wealth of nations. We live in a time of urgency. It's a time for action. It's a time for possibilities. It's a time for what the magnetic chancellor of Syracuse, Nancy Cantor, has called scholarship in action. Scholarship in action. Many of the people in our country are questioning the institutions of higher education on matters of affordability, on matters of access, and most importantly for many of us, certainly for me, on our aloofness from our communities and from public concerns. There's a widespread decline in public confidence in what we do, with many people pointing to the isolating effects of professionalization and specialization on the part of our graduate students and on the part of our faculty. As several people have pointed out, the public perceive what we do as providing private goods rather than public goods. And that's a mistake, and it's something that we need to change. So on the one hand, we have these matters of urgency and problems, and on the other hand, I think it's a fortuitous coalition, you might say, and juxtaposition of forces. We have at the same time the rise of these new media that actually are making it possible for us to reach larger publics. We have new educational and intellectual spaces, and I really want to underline that word intellectual, which is a word that has been banned from public discourse for several decades now. It's time to bring it back and to be proud of it. We have at the same time, as you mentioned, we have multimodal forms of publication or of dissemination at our hands, and there are things that we need to use. You all know that undergraduates have grown up working in communities. They're very different from undergraduates of 20 years ago or 30 years ago. They've grown up in what I call screen culture, not book culture. They're digital natives. At the same time, there are new modes of undergraduate learning, which have not yet quite percolated up to the level of graduate learning, but it is happening. Service learning, community-based learning, and experiential learning. More work is being done at the undergraduate level that's portfolio and project-based. It's often web-based. And many of our graduate students are restless. They want to connect their scholarship with concerns that reach a larger public, concerns that are larger than purely professional. In short, In the midst of the corporatization of the university, as well as the contraction of higher education, which we're experiencing right now, as well as the crisis in publishing, which we're all aware of, scholarly publishing, there's nonetheless a convergence of the goals of public scholarship on the one hand and the digital humanities on the other. And I truly believe that this convergence offers us a pragmatic optimism for the future of scholarly communication. In deploying this word convergence, I am hearing, and I want you to hear too, the title of Henry Jenkins' important book, Convergence Culture, Where Old and New Media Collide. He's a scholar at MIT who is just moving to USC because MIT was not providing him in the humanities a productive enough place to flourish. I also want you to hear, as I told you, the title of Benkler's book, The Wealth of Networks, How Social Production Transforms Markets and Freedom. As I mentioned, he strikes also a pragmatic tone of optimism that the new information technologies can in fact help us create a more democratic society. So rather than the networked information environment, which is his term, the networked information environment, I'm interested specifically in the networked education or intellectual environment that we find in projects, research projects, scholarly projects with a digital component. My key terms today are public scholarship, digital humanities, within the first part of my talk, the word interdisciplinarity providing a bridge between the two. I'm going to begin with a brief sketch of the historical context of what's called public scholarship, along with a program at my own center for doctoral students. The center, the Simpson Center for the Humanities, which, as I mentioned, has spent the last 5 years working with an initiative on the digital humanities. One of our major missions is public scholarship. I'm going to offer 2 examples of scholarship that's gone digital, and along the way I'm going to refer to an important paper released by an organization entitled Imagining America. I'll explain in a minute. It's a report on scholarship promotion and tenure in the university and in community colleges, an entire spectrum of institutions, and it's an exceedingly important report. So first, public humanities. It's not the world that has refused the humanities, it's the humanities that have refused the world. Reconsidering that choice should be the chief duty of a new generation of scholars. Those are the words, and I agree with them, those are the words of Robert Weisbach, who was then president of the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, speaking at a meeting of the American Council of Learned Societies a few years ago. It's the humanities that have refused the world, he said, referring to the extreme professionalization and specialization of our humanities scholars in institutions of higher education. He's right. Since the end of the Second World War, we've seen the increasing professionalization of the university, with our departments and universities retreating from communities. I agree with the American historian Thomas Bender, who has studied the history of universities, predominantly universities, but to a lesser extent colleges and community colleges since the Second World War. And he said that there's a certain paradox in the success of the academy, that our recognized achievements, and this includes disciplinary excellence, and it also includes a huge expansion, obviously, of its place, the academy's place in our culture, that at the same time, these successes haven't really strengthened higher education as a whole. As he said, it's even produced conflicts about its mission and particularly its civic role, and there's been a loosening of the informal compact between the university and society. In using the term compact, he's referring not only to the founding of our land-grant universities in the United States. It's very important that we have this historical context for public scholarship, but also to important efforts over the last 25 years to renew the role of civic education. For 25 years, many of us have been knocking at the wall, so to speak, saying, let our scholars out of the university. So here are some of those developments. Campus Compact, some of you may have heard of. It's a national organization founded in 1985 to press for the intertwined values of service learning and the responsibilities of citizenship. And it now has more than 1,000 colleges and university members. In 1989, there was an important conference held at Racine, Wisconsin, which is in the Wingspread Conference Center, known for its dedication to higher education. The paper that was presented there, Making Connections, the Humanities, Culture, and Community, was a very important paper that was since published by ACLS. This was 1989, this was 20 years ago. This paper is still being disseminated. Some of you will know Ernest Boyer's influential work from the 1990s on what constitutes scholarship for our era, he said, and he used the word at that point, engagement. Some of you may never have heard of his work. Very, very important for what has been called metropolitan universities, as opposed to, they should not be opposed, as opposed to other research universities. Another conference at Wingspread in 1998 on the civic mission of higher education, resulting in a declaration that underscored the highly individual mode of scholarly production in universities. Faculties are socialized throughout their graduate school preparation to think in highly individualized and privatized terms about their work in ways that make it difficult to believe in the possibilities for effective cooperative action for change. I agree. And then I want to add two more developments. In 1999, plans were laid at the White House, and it was that White House in Washington, D.C., to create an organization called Artists and Scholars in Public Life under the rubric of Imagining America. Why Imagining America? You might remember that Hillary Clinton was First Lady then, and she liked the term Imagining America, and so that was the term that this organization took. It was quite a heady experience. Actually, I was there along with the head of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, and several of us from Humanities centers, and we had great hopes for this organization, which some years later has produced this important report that I referred to before, and I'll come back to later. It was established at the University of Michigan. It's now at Syracuse, and it itself organizes an annual meeting every year. It numbers some 85 colleges across the country, and what's important about this is that it's the spectrum of colleges, from community colleges on the one hand, schools of art and design on the other, to colleges, liberal arts schools, and research universities. It's very important because these institutions do not sufficiently speak to one another and coordinate higher education across the country. I was actually the founding chair of the advisory board of Imagining America, and I'm very taken with the phrase now, public knowledge. We're inventing many terms to describe these things, and for those of you who are interested in the developments in the social sciences, Craig Calhoun, who is the head of the Social Science Research Council, has started an institute at New York University, which is called the Institute for Public Knowledge. It's very, very much about creating knowledge with larger publics beyond the scholarly community in the university. I want to mention, too, that more universities around the country, and I'd be interested in case, have recently explicitly incorporated civic responsibility in their missions. The University of Minnesota, which was one of our first land-grant universities to be founded, today defines its mission in terms of education, research, and public engagement. It's just right up there. And as I mentioned before, Syracuse University, right there on their website, says they are about scholarship in action. And they're very, very much keyed into integrating the work of Syracuse with the work of the community, the larger community as a whole. Over the past 25 years, the vocabulary has shifted decidedly, not decisively, but decidedly, from service to engagement. And this is an important shift because it marks a move from thinking in terms of a more paternalistic relation to one that is far more reciprocal and cooperative and collaborative. And here I want to move to interdisciplinarity. The terms disciplinarity and interdisciplinary belong really only to one sector, and that is to the academic sector. You do not hear a lot of people in a community talking about disciplinarity, unless it's connected to a dog, I guess. And while there's a fairly stable notion of what disciplinarity is, I think there's a movable feast when it comes to the term interdisciplinary. Interdisciplinary, the term itself was first used right at the turn of the 20th century, or certainly in the 20s. We found examples of usage of it, and it's been used throughout our history in the academy to describe various movements. You can imagine that, of course, the new curricula and the new research that emerged in the 60s and the 70s in accordance with the feminist movement and the civil rights movement, women's studies and African American studies, this of course represents interdisciplinary research. At the same time too, we've seen emerge recently a larger emphasis on problem-based research when it comes to, say, public health, or when it comes to environmental problems. So a whole new host of different kinds of research and different kinds of teams being put together. And it's my hunch now, what I've seen is that that word interdisciplinary is so capacious that it's now referring, at least to the doctoral students I know, to students who are interested in work that is public scholarship, and they're not sure what kind of name to put on it, and so they use the word interdisciplinary to describe it. The word interdisciplinary is a kind of empty term that can really trace what the values are often of a particular generation. And it's become code, at least in the graduate students I know, for students who are interested in connecting their work to a larger public. I've seen this confirmed in the program which I mentioned that we instituted at the University of Washington at the Simpson Center for the Humanities. This was separate from the Digital Humanities Initiative, and we didn't know that the two were going to converge, and remarkably so. 6 years ago, we started an institute for the public humanities for doctoral students, responding to this desire on the part of students to connect their research with larger publics. That emerged out of an institutional call on the part of Bob Weisbuck, who was then president of the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation. There was a program called Re-envisioning the PhD, and that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to re-envision the PhD. And this is how we began. We began with this institute that is a week-long institute before school begins for some 20 doctoral students from different domains of the university. There's a hefty list of readings. There are site visits in the community, working with museums, working with community colleges. Those were the sites we selected actually the very, very first year. And there are also talks by faculty members who have done public humanities projects, speakers brought in, et cetera. I'm not going to describe it in any detail, but I do want you to know that I'm passionate about this program. I think it's really tapping into the desire of these graduate students to create a new form of research for themselves, to imagine what their role could be as a faculty member when they go on, hopefully, let us pray, to positions in higher educations at community colleges and other institutions around the country. What do they say about the Institute? They say that they found solidarity with a like-minded cohort. They're not saying this in their classes in their own departments. I'm in a department of English, and I can assure you that the students are not saying that in their doctoral seminars. They're saying that they found confidence in pursuing those initiatives. They're saying that they're being given a new language for their public-minded projects. There's a whole new vocabulary out there, from activist scholars to an older terminology like public intellectual, which I hope will make its way back into everyday life in the United States. Literally, the Institute has been giving hope to these students who have felt an incredible chasm between, on the one hand, certain kinds of projects that they wanted to do and their own scholarly research on the other hand. As one of the doctoral students said, and he is working actually in Hawaiian. This is for you, in Hawaiian literary and cultural studies. He said he couldn't have imagined before that scholarship could take on that amplitude, that he could work with his own communities and find different ways to present his research. For those already working in the community, and I'm thinking here of a person in comparative literature, a doctoral student who had launched a wonderful literacy program in a shelter for battered women in Seattle. And by the way, the daughters of these women said, when are we going to have our reading group? She created then a reading group for the 12-year-olds and the 13-year-olds and the 14-year-olds, and she is twinning this with her own literary criticism on the books that they're reading. For all of these students, the very idea that public scholarship could be part of their lives created a new sense of meaning for them, and a possibility where before there was only a profession, there was now a calling, something central to their lives. And I'm reminded here of the words of the sociologist, whom I know you will know, C. Wright Mills, who insisted that scholarship is a choice of how to live as well as a career. And this is what it should be. I think many of you will have seen the report that came out just recently from UCLA's Higher Education Institute. It was just reported in, every morning I read Inside Higher Ed. I don't know if it flashes across your screen, but it does mine. And it was reported also in the Chronicle of Higher Education that the proportion of faculty members nationwide who believe it's important to teach undergraduates to become agents of social change is now substantially greater than the proportion who believe it's important to teach the classics of Western civilization. Some people regard this as a cause for crisis. I don't. I don't. This is now where I want to shift to digital humanities, or what I would call better the new communication technologies or the new media technologies. For as you know, the modes of scholarly communication are changing with the coevolution of information and communication technologies. Scholarship is going multimodal, assuming new forms and hybrid shapes. And let me just mention, as I told you, when our institute started 6 years ago, we were doing off-site collaborations with the museum and with, in Seattle, in Bellevue, near Microsoft, is Bellevue Community College with community colleges. And this last September, this is just you all know what websites look like, but what I do want you to know is if you want to find out anything about this institute, There are all kinds of resources, from the list of the readings to who the people were who participated. Everything's up there. What were our site visits this last September? On the one hand, there was the Center for Civic Engagement, Communication and Civic Engagement, which is directed by Lance Bennett, is funded in part by the MacArthur Foundation. The MacArthur Foundation right now has a huge initiative on digital media and learning for young people. And this is precisely what the connection was: young people, digital media, learning. The other site for us was public television. We went off to a public television station, and our students were working with creating programs with people at the public television station. So you can see that we moved. This wasn't something that was even planned in our heads. We just moved towards these sites where there was going to be a collaboration between our doctoral students, the kinds of research that they wanted to do, and the resources that they found at these places. And so at this point, I want to single out two of our projects. They're faculty graduate student projects that have been presented at the institutes as models of research. The first is American Sabor, Latinos in U.S. Popular Music, and the second one is called Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History. Crucial to them is communication of the research via website. Print publication, first standalone print publication, comes, if it comes, only after. And then number two, very important, is that the model is one of collaboration that involves faculty, students, and multiple community partners. Very, very important. So the first one, American Sabor. Sabor means, this is very rough translation, it means many, many things, but one could say it means flavor. Many people translate it as flavor. So American, the flavor, the Latino flavor. Latinos in U.S. popular music. Submerged as a partnership between faculty and doctoral students at the University of Washington and Seattle's Experience Music Project. Some of you will know what that is. It's a museum that was created by Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft, and he's a big burly guy with a guitar and absolutely loves music. He created this museum devoted to American popular music, and it's designed by Frank Gehry. And you're all very well of Frank Gehry's designs, of course, here. But here it's the business school, right? Yeah, very impressive. This began as a seminar, a graduate seminar. The idea began as a graduate seminar. It expanded to an undergraduate course. It moved to this public space, and then it moved to modules being prepared for the schools. The museum exhibit, though, was absolutely central to it. So a university and a museum came together to create the first ever exhibit, ever, in both English and Spanish, on the contributions of Latinos to American popular music. The first ever in the United States. It should have been done a long time ago, of course. The exhibit opened at this Frank Gehry designed museum, Experience Music Project, in October of 2007, and it was up an entire year, and it's now traveling around the country. The next place it went was Miami. Perfect place for it to go. Curriculum materials have been prepared for it, including image galleries and historical timelines and oral histories. They've been designed for Spanish classes, for social studies classes, for music teachers at all levels, but predominantly middle school and high school levels. This is when another partner came in, KEXP, which is an independent radio station in Seattle, and some of you may have heard of it. I don't know if it plays in Cleveland, but it does play in several other places around the country. And modules have been prepared for it, listening modules, one of which I'm going to play a part of in just a second. So imagine the premise of the exhibit is that Latino contributions to popular music have far too often been relegated to the margins, that we have conceived of as American popular music in great part in the United States as predominantly black and white. But Latinos have made amazing contributions to hip hop and rock and roll and R&B and jazz, and this is exactly what was being detailed in this exhibit. And this is when we're going to see if this works. So this is one of the sound modules. If you go to, I love this, all right. Some of you heard this test before. Exactly. You're going to hear a scholar's voice come in because this is an educational module, and he is an ethnomusicologist who is just, he can play all of these instruments.
Santana's soulful electric guitar helped create new audiences for this song, which was originally written and recorded by Tito Puente in New York in 1963.
As a scholar, he had to learn how to condense, where before it would be a 30-page article, it was now 2 sentences. And the negotiation between the museum, the radio station, and the scholar was something to behold. There's some 12 of these. And as I say, he's gifted. He can play all the instruments. You know, he pantomimes the instruments when he's demonstrating them.
A dance music that started in Cuba in the early 1950s. The cha-cha-cha was first played by a small orchestra called a charanga.
So then he's training us to be able to hear these. If you go to the exhibit, you'd be able to go into a sound booth and listen to these and then see everything else. But for those of us who will never be at the exhibit, I'm sorry, we're going to have to say goodbye to it. Such a pleasure. All right, we're saying goodbye. So, such a pleasure. I chose this as my first example because, and in doing so, my major point is that for centuries now, we have assumed that the natural medium, in a sense, the only medium for research is the medium of print. And of course, we're in a library that is in the midst of transformation, of moving from being completely book-centered to having all kinds of different materials located in it. And so that's one of the things that I really want you to leave with, that our research can take different shapes and different forms. And here the acoustical is absolutely crucial. Do you remember Walter Ong? Some of you, in 1980, he published a book entitled Orality and Literacy, the Technologizing of the World and the Word. And he was making the point that we're in a phase of secondary orality. And this is a perfect example of this, that we've moved through a kind of print culture. We're existing simultaneously in a print culture and a screen culture. And the acoustical is very, very, very important to the culture in which we're living now. I do completely believe that we're in a revolution comparable to those of the advent of writing and the Gutenberg era. Today, many of our modes of communication bear the imprint of orality, a resemblance to the spoken word as much as to traditional forms of writing. And this is what Alex Wright has to say. He has a book entitled Glut, very unfortunately, but the subtitle, Mastering Information Through the Ages. It's a popular book. It's, I think, of interest to people who are passionate about libraries and the different shape that they've taken. And this is what he says. He says, oral traditions are additive rather than subordinative, aggregative rather than analytic, empathetic and participatory rather than objectively distanced, and situational rather than abstract. And I think that's an accurate description of the museum exhibit and these sound modules that I've mentioned, of which there are some 12. Empathetic rather than abstract. I think I think this is a very, very good description of the kinds of values that can be instantiated in this form of research. We'd also want to ask the question to what extent the iconographic, that is to say, the visual as in this mode of visual over here, as opposed to print, is also present in this kind of research. And for me, it certainly is. So I'm just going to run through a few slides here of the exhibit, some of the materials that came out of the exhibit. You see how dependent it is on the iconographic as opposed to 4 pages of the analytical. This is what the sound booths look like in the Frank Gehry building of the Experienced Music Project. Again, very, very important, graphic information, more maps, the border crossed us. All of these various vectors of where these influences came from and where they flowed. Amazing, Alice Baggs, a Latino who was very influential in the punk scene, and then here we have the Spanish language relatives of hip hop. The iconographic here is absolutely crucial. And this is what you see when you go to the website of the Experienced Music Project Museum. Obviously, they've archived it just as you are archiving all of your things here at your library. Second project, very briefly, this is the Seattle. This is actually where you can go to KEXP and, no, that's still the American Music, Experienced Music Project. What am I doing? Okay, all right, this is, quickly now, this is the second project I want to mention by an historian. It's called Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History, and for me, it's a model of collaborative research in the humanities, as well as a model of convergence media. And by convergence here, I want you to hear that the content of the research is moving across different mediums. That's very, very important. Research that's in book culture often stays, it's the article or it's the book, it's the article or it's the book, it's that print medium. But what we're seeing is now research and scholarship that's moving across different modes and different kinds of media. This project's directed by Jim Gregory, an absolutely wonderful historian of the US. It began as an undergraduate teaching experiment. He was hoping that he'd be able to motivate his undergraduate seniors to do research by promising that if they did really, really, really well, he would put their essay, he would publish their essay on the web. And they did fabulous, fabulous research on civil rights in Seattle and labor history. And the point is in great part that those two movements were not separate in Seattle, labor history and civil rights, but they came together. And that in the US, we were the city that had in great part many communities of color participating in civil rights struggles, which added a different dimension to our civil rights struggles. Seriously insignificant, different aspect to it. In the book Convergence Culture, the Henry Jenkins book I mentioned earlier, he's arguing that the role of consumers is not the same as it has been in the past with centralized mass media like television. Our role is not to serve as passive spectators, but to serve as participant. And analogously, we have exactly the same thing going on here. We've got students who are not sitting in a classroom being passive absorbers of knowledge, although there is a critique we can make of what does it mean that you're passive when you're sitting in an audience, very active going on in your head. But they are creating history at the same time. And what he did was he had his students as historians, as practicing historians. He had them go down to our archives in our city and look up the real estate covenants. And you look up those real estate covenants and you see, oh, in this area of town, people from Japan were not allowed to buy property. Or in this other area of town, people from China were not allowed to buy property, they became not only practicing historians, but when he published their work up on the website, they became published historians at the same time. Very, very exciting for them. And particularly exciting for them was that this jumped media. Some of you may know that we now, i.e. Seattle, is now a one-paper town. We used to have 2 papers, and I think it was yesterday, we went to 1 paper, and the Seattle Post-Intelligencer was our more liberal paper, a word I honor. But I'm very pleased to report to you that our other paper, our morning newspaper, the Seattle Times, picked up the research that these students had done and published it on their front page. Undergraduates, their research hitting the front page of the Seattle Times. It doesn't look like it was the front page, but it was the front page. Oh, actually, that isn't what I asked to be put up here. This is something else. But trust me, it did. So very exciting. Their paper, which was going, the newspaper, which was going into homes all across Seattle, was carrying their research. I want to say something about the website. I said before, you all know what websites look like. This website actually created one of the most important intangible affective dimensions that we can create among people, and that is the value of trust. This website, it might look like any other website. People gave their stories to these undergraduates. There were many interviews that were being done. Interviews with people who were about to vanish from this life were telling stories from the 60s and from the 40s. And this was, in a sense, what I want to get away from the language of property rights, but this was something so dear to them, and it was something that they felt they could, at this point, really share, that they could trust these people coming from the University of Washington to create a space in which their experience would be honored. And I think this is absolutely crucial. We talk in Seattle about, and I know everybody else does around the country, about sustainability. And within the academic context, it's often something like, and how are you going to sustain that program? And what people mean by sustain that program is, where are you going to get the cash to do it? Where are you going to find the funds to do it? Sustainability often is only about that. That's what people mean by sustainability. But within the public humanities, sustainability means something much, much larger than that. It really means about creating relationships with people and communities, and having that instantiated, that relationship instantiated by that remarkable quality of trust. So it may be that you don't do something for 3 years with that particular organization or people, but it could be that 4 years from now you do, and you go back, and there's this connection that is still there that allows you to build on it. That in and of itself is a mark of sustainability, absolutely crucial. All websites are not created equal. In other words, this was very, very important. I want to mention too, referring to Clifford Lynch, who's the director, I know many of you will know who he is, of course, is the director of the Coalition for Networked Information. He's very, very smart about how we've become confused about how research circulates. As he said, all across the country, not dissertations, but MA theses are being downloaded, are being read. And as opposed to our dissertations, of which and I know many people in this room have recently finished. These papers by these undergraduates are being read all over the country a website, and we can all say, look, a website has how many people visiting it, et cetera. This website has 10,000 people visiting it every month. A lot of those people are middle school kids and high school kids who are reading the research of undergraduates that has been vetted by their teacher at the University of Washington. I regard this as a perfect example of public scholarship. And I should mention too that it just hasn't been bringing people together in virtual space, but also in face-to-face space. Jim Gregory, he began his career as a faculty member thinking he would write books for the rest of his life. He has now been invited by our city council to come in and talk about the history of Seattle civil rights and labor as preparation, historical preparation for diversity training. I mean, that's how we refer to it, and it's just a bald and really awkward term. To give that an historical context within the city in which people are working is so important. Just let me mention that my own profession is complicit with thinking that all research takes the form of monographs and books. In a report that came out from the Modern Language Association, that's my own scholarly professional organization, we call it a professional organization, some 48% of people have never had any experience in reviewing scholarship online or books that have been published in digital format. That's even worse, some 65%. But this is work that even looks like articles and books in print. No experience whatsoever in looking at this kind of research. In my own organization, my own university, I can predict with absolute accurately that 99% of the faculty would not think that these two projects I've mentioned constitute research. They do. They're impeccable instances of research, and we absolutely need to encourage it and to, in the language of a university, reward it, and we need to keep it safe in our wonderful libraries. And here I want to refer to a report that came out from Imagining America on public scholarship, and I'm just going to pass this around. This is a very important, very important report that advocates for this form of scholarship and gives us ideas about how to do so. I pulled together a group of graduate students, faculty, and administrators at my university to talk about the report over lunch. We called it an agenda lunch, and I believe it's actually been read, which is more than we can say for most reports, I think. As you mentioned, this is an example where the public humanities and the digital humanities intersect, but intersect also with the academic humanities, all three, one and the same. So project 3. This is in honor of your library. I want to close with a reference to another project I much admire, although I don't consider this project to fall under the rubric of research. It is a public humanities project, but I wouldn't consider it a research project, at least not yet. The September Project. It's one that's built around 3 networks. These networks culminate in an educational or intellectual network. Its founders, David Silver and Sarah Washburn. David Silver used to be a faculty member at the University of Washington. Unfortunately, we lost him to another university, in great part because he felt he wasn't going to be able to pursue the public work that he wanted to do at the University of Washington. And Sarah Washburn, who used to work with the Gates Foundation in its library area, they had an idea that on September 11th, which was a Saturday, the first year that they did this, which was 2004, they wanted libraries around the United States to have meetings where people would talk about ideas of citizenship, ideas of democracy, whatever seemed to make sense in terms of civic values. They had an idea, and it was the digital infrastructure that in part helped them to be able to create that. So using email and listservs and self-generated networks, they created a day where, that very first year they did it, nearly 500 libraries in 9 countries hosted events on September 11th. What were the networks involved? On the one hand, it was the digital network, the listservs, the maps, with their wonderful little push pins showing us where these sites were. Importantly, it was the physical structure of the library, right? This is where we were all going to meet. And it was also a social network. This was organized in great part by librarians all around the country. And I remember it became a kind of messianic goal of ours. This was a project that was underwritten by the Simpson Center as well. So David and Sarah are in one little office, and we're in our little offices, and we want every state in the United States to have at least one library participating in this. And so various other kinds of calls would go out. I'd call a person I know in Arkansas, or someone would email, or someone, and we got every state in the union to participate in that very first year of the September Project. You will remember that was an election year, and it was an important election year. And it was very important to us that we have these conversations about ideas of democracy and citizenship and war going on around the world. And this is still going strong. So in closing, the September Project's an example, and I think it's an excellent example of what Benkler calls the networked information society, where the aggregate effect of individual action on a wide scale produces a large collaborative effort, conversations around the world, gatherings that aren't market-driven. There aren't goods that are being bought and sold. It's a form of education, conversations in libraries motivated by a thirst for education and a belief in public spaces of dialogue and deliberation, thus representing a decisive shift from the mass-mediated point of commercial communication, television, to a network of public spheres. Benkler insists, as I mentioned before, that non-market individual and social action is the most important domain in the furtherance of core liberal values. And libraries, and I believe this, I think libraries are arguably the most democratic institution we have in the whole United States. Embodies perfectly for me the intellectual wealth of networks, not nations. Thanks.
For your very inspiring talk. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave right after this. But you mentioned Henry Jenkins' research at MIT, and I know he was putting together a database of sequences of films from around the world that ran into a lot of copyright problems. I was wondering if you know if he's going to be taking that to USC and what's happening to that project.
I wish I knew. I don't. I'm sorry. I don't know anything about that. We are in a public forum, but I guess I could say, since I alluded to it before, that he had an uneasy relationship to some of his colleagues who are very print-based and can imagine scholarship taking only one form, a very uneasy relation. And here you are in film, as well as literature, and of course, we need to imagine that our own research is going to take different shapes. So I wish I knew about that database. I don't know what's happened to it. Please.
I was just curious regarding the two projects that you started off with. How do you exactly enlist faculty, especially junior faculty, who are concerned with tenure and promotion?
Exactly.
When, like you yourself mentioned, and this has been a recurring theme, that a lot of institutions do not look upon that as equivalent to a monograph publication or X amount of scholarly journal articles and so forth, how do you get them then to participate
accept
or
it.
engage?
Exactly. This is one of the ironies, and this is perhaps first going to sound discouraging, but then I think encouraging. One of the reasons why I actually went back 25 years is to give a context for this that is long and noble. That's very important. Secondly, the way I work is exceedingly pragmatic within my own university, which is to say, whenever I have a chance to talk about this, I do. We have a new dean of our graduate school, and he actually asked me to come and speak on public scholarship. This is, well, it's now not unheard of, which is just wonderful. That's very unusual. The agenda lunch I mentioned before, where I asked everybody to read the report. I'm passing around the report, but this is a little catalog from American Sabor. That was very important. I had this lunch before school started so that people would not be completely taken up with having to run off to class or having to go to a meeting. And I had deans there. And if you get one dean, then you'll get another dean. Excuse me if there are any deans in the audience. But you know how that works. And everybody read the, so we're proceeding in that way. Jim Gregory is a full professor. He didn't regard this as research when he began it. He now is convinced that this is research and that he himself is transformed by this experience, and speaks about research for his junior colleagues in a completely different way. So it's cumulative, but it's also just very pragmatic, and keep pushing on it. And I've become, at this point in my life, I've become very interested in institutional change, and so I actually believe in the importance of reports and the importance of people reading them. And so, unfortunately for me, if I'm now given the opportunity to write one, I do. And I slipped into a report that I just finished for the Modern Language Association. There was a little recommendation that said, we urge people to consider things that are beyond the dominance of the monograph. And I slipped into that recommendation. I realize I'm being taped. I slipped into that recommendation to consider work produced in new media and public scholarship. People on that committee had been asking me what public scholarship is. They had never heard of the phrase. They didn't know anything about the historical context of it. And so that's where I can move. And the Institute is another example. We now have 120 graduate students who have gone through this institute. And they're going to make a difference. Some of them are already in jobs at other universities, and they're just going to make a difference. So it's aggregative.
I saw the American Sabor exhibit, and it's fantastic, and I was really interested when...
Where'd you go? Where'd you go to it?
At the Experience.
You did, wonderful.
And the role, clearly, of students in the university was really interesting in that. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe the students' role in the kind of conceptualization of that project. You said it started as a seminar. Mm-hmm. And the other thing you talked about that I thought was interesting was the kind of real negotiation that going between the scholar and the museum professional and the radio station worker, and probably an undergraduate student, around the idea of disciplinarity, right? Because in some ways that kind of a project isn't only interdisciplinary, it's anti-disciplinary. It exposes the way that disciplines kind of restrict ways that we can know. So what were the students sort of able to do, grad or undergrad, kind of in that process? Now,
in that particular project, the students were all graduate students. It was a graduate seminar, and they were students from ethnomusicology, which, if I can just bluntly characterize, I think more open to many different forms than possibly some students in other sections of the music curriculum might be. They participated in the sound modules, the graduate students, so you'll see when, if you go to look, you're going to see that there are different names on them. So they fully participated. It came down to, in the end, though, 2 graduate students taking very direct roles along with 3 faculty. But in the course itself, the students were doing lots of, the research that we would all do, going to archives and that kind of research. In terms of negotiation, I might have been erring on the side of optimism when it comes to presenting the happy cooperation among these three different sectors: University of Washington, the Experience Music Project, and KEXP. There are some frayed nerves there. Intellectual ownership is a problem. Where names go is a negotiation. How in a museum you will have a little tag, and will there be a name there attributing authorship or names, collaborative authorship? A lot of those, I can't even say that they were worked out. Some of those decisions were simply made. And collaboration across, the word sector has never come easily off my lips, but now I'm beginning to use it. Across these sectors is much more difficult than one would imagine. And the illusion of having to move from, look, in order to convey the history of something, you have to have a 3-volume set, to no, you're only going to have 5 sentences. That is huge and was very difficult. Very difficult. Very, very important learning experience. We're now involved in a 2-year grant. By we, I mean the Simpson Center, to kind of reestablish patterns of collaboration among these 3 sectors. So we will see what comes from this. Yeah.
Kathleen.
Yeah.
Multi-part question. What are some of the main areas in digital humanities for the Simpson Center going forward? And who are your partners both on campus and off campus for that?
We're really project-based at this point, and so there are projects that come to us from faculty and graduate students. We operate predominantly on a competitive funding model, so people submit proposals to us. And one of them is medieval manuscripts and the different editions of, for those of you who know the history of English literature and language, Piers Plowman is a very, very important poem. And we have a scholar working on that poem that is going to be, he's working, and this is something we're trying to encourage, he's working with a faculty member in our Information Sciences School of Information, actually, to create a program that will allow all of the variations to be able to be read on a website. I actually consider that a little bit more of a conventional scholarly project. And then on the other hand, we've got graduate students who have been working on blogging and have been working with our library downtown, as we refer to it, our library downtown on that, which is a much messier project. In terms of outside partners, I mentioned before that we had just received a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is truly a challenge grant since we have to raise $1.875 million in order to receive the money. And we've talked with people at Microsoft about possible projects in the future. So this could be an outside partner in that. But we don't have a project yet that we're ready to work on. Anything else?
Maybe just to follow up on Tom's question, do you do any, if not collaboration, at least correspondence with other institutions that do similar projects? Like, for example, I know at Maryland they're doing something similar with the Shakespeare photos, I believe it is. So is there any kind of interaction there?
Right. In fact, let me give an example with the Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History Project. That project has been inspiring to many history, predominantly history faculty around the country, and San Francisco State is now actually going to do a similar project. Of course, research is also disseminated in scholarly conferences, and faculty members at San Francisco State found out about it as a result of Jim Gregory presenting this at the American Historical Association. So they've now started up their own project, and at the same time, unbeknownst to each of us, the University of California at Irvine Humanities Research Institute, which serves the entire state of California, and it's just a humanities center to die for because it's got all of those faculty spread out across the whole state of California. Along with the San Diego Supercomputing Center, they have a project called Redlining California, which is very, very similar to Seattle civil rights in terms of the redlining of Seattle in terms of real estate. And so they're in touch with each other too. Right, very important that those projects create their own intellectual networks, exactly right.
On a pragmatic point, around here we're trying to explore and participate in different national consortia and relationships, and I'm just curious which of those you might find to be particularly valuable or recommend that we participate in particularly actively. And I'm sorry, you're being recorded, so I'll also note that.
You know, that's a very difficult question to answer. HASTAC now, which was mentioned before, which is Humanities, Arts, Sciences, Technology Advanced Collaboratory, has an annual meeting, and it's been inspiring to go to those meetings. I cannot go to the April meeting because our state of Washington, our legislators, in their wisdom, voted to not allow travel on state funds. So I don't get to go this April to their meeting. Otherwise, I would definitely be going. So HASTAC, very, very, very good. Their annual meeting is at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. Imagining America is very important if you believe in public scholarship and want really the inspiration of other models and other people around the country. There's an annual meeting there, and they're meeting in New Orleans in October 1, 2, 3, if I'm remembering correctly. Well,